Hello and welcome to the Spiked podcast. I'm Fraser Myers, and with me, as ever, we have Spiked editor Tom Slater.
Hello.
And Spiked columnist Ella Whelan.
Hi.
Coming up on the show, Canada's Freedom Convoy, the crisis in Ukraine, the EU's assault on Poland and Hungary, and the Tory war on woke. So this week, at the beginning of this week, Justin Trudeau launched a serious crackdown on the Canadian Freedom Convoy. He used some extraordinary emergency powers to essentially treat these protesters as terrorists, more or less. Tom, you've been following this story quite closely. What have you made of it?
We just sort of poured kerosene on the fire and made such a dramatic and authoritarian intervention that even following where Trudeau has been going during the pandemic and during this particular protest and this particular crisis, I think was surprising to a lot of people. So as you say, he invoked this Emergencies Act for the first time in its kind of current form, as far as I understand it, allowing all sorts of different measures to be implemented to try and bring the protesters to heel. So banks can now freeze accounts linked to the protesters without even having to get a court order. The police have given more powers to fine and to arrest protesters, particularly the more disruptive ones. And there's also been discussions about, again, kind of further restricting how they can get funds, and this being part of the kind of broadening of their funding of terrorist activities. This is really incredibly extreme stuff. And it was what I think one of the things that was so striking about it, even though we sort of know this and we've been talking about this a long time, is just how incredibly authoritarian these kind of centrist technocrats are and how much of a free pass they get from the kind of international liberal human rights set. I mean, there's been barely a whimper of protest, certainly not from other Western leaders, when this is a remarkable escalation. I mean, to treat your own citizens as basically a domestic terrorist threat is an incredibly serious thing to do. And yet we've seen it in America happen, we're seeing it in Canada, and yet barely a whimper of protest from anywhere else in the world. So it does seem that you can indulge in all kinds of deeply authoritarian measures so long as you're a photogenic liberal. It seems like that's definitely one of the takeaways from this week.
And the crackdown is very much addressed, in progressive language. I mean, the excuse is that these people are far right, that they're racist, transphobic, misogynistic. I mean, what have you made of that? That kind of, we've always said that wokeness, so to speak, has an authoritarian bent, but here it's really explicit, that link.
It's really explicit, and it's such a distraction tactic because the protests are not anything to do with the row about trans ideology or critical race theory in schools or any of those sort of quote unquote woke things. It's about mandates for coronavirus vaccines. It's about the coronavirus restrictions that have been in place throughout Canada. And so the government is not even dealing with the issue at hand. It's just like saying, no, we don't want to have that row, so we're just going to call you a racist or a transphobe. It's like shorthand for you're a bad person. I think it's becoming increasingly clear that this is pretty much action taken by Trudeau because he sees this as a battle for him. It's all about himself. It's incredibly narcissistic. Whereas other more sensible or perhaps more in touch with reality politicians would see that there is a genuine, whatever you think about some of the truckers, some pictures show them, go, as you pointed out, Tom, going around on bouncy castles or, doing things that are certainly not kind of like terrorist actions. But on the other hand, I'm sure there are a lot of Ottawans who are quite pissed off at this point and would just quite like their streets to get back to normal. There's a push and pull here. We can think of other protests, for example, when Extinction Rebellion people were shutting down Trafalgar Square. It annoyed the hell out of me. But that, there's a discussion to be had there about the freedom of protest and public nuisance. But that's not what he wants to do. What he's seeing this as a judgment on him, Justin Trudeau, as a politician. And if he gives any ground to any kind of sense that freedom of protest is an important part of a democracy, then it's like he's conceding within himself. And it's leading to very dark ends, because the precedent to set using these kind of emergency laws should make all politically active people shiver, whether or not you do support the kind of actions and the desires of these particular truckers.
And Tom, I mean, what do you make of the way that it almost feels as if power is kind of coalescing against the protests in the sense that, this week we're talking about the state crackdown, but in previous weeks we've talked about big tech getting involved, that kind of thing.
No, you kind of see all of the sort of different parts of the sort of elite and sections of the new elite kind of coalescing against them, as you say. So there was the GoFundMe thing, which was so striking because not only basically depriving the truckers of their millions of dollars of donations that they'd managed to amass, but at one point even suggesting that people had to apply for their refund if they'd made a donation. If they didn't, they would just kind of reallocate it to what they called credible causes, which is an incredibly arrogant thing to do. As you say, there's the police response, there's a response from the Canadian state. Even before these new measures came in, there were certain Canadian banks that were freezing accounts and all this kind of thing. So it's really quite striking. I mean, of course, there's aspects to this protest which are, of course, disruptive, which are about blocking bridges, which are about trying to seriously bring the government to heel. And of course, there's always going to be consequences when you kind of break the law and you do these kinds of things. I mean, but as far as I understand it, I'm willing to be corrected on this, but like the Ambassador Bridge, which is one of these main kind of points of connection, one of the main ones between Canada and the US, was already in the process of being cleared, I think, when these rules came in. And this is about depriving the entire protest of these funds. And as you were saying, Ella, you look at a lot of the live streams, much of this is quite kind of carnivalesque, if anything else. It's people parked up, again, dancing, singing, waving flags, all the rest of it. So it's such an overreaction. And I think, as you say, it shows that Trudeau is kind of in a bit of a fight for his own survival. Various other kind of premiers of different provinces have been far more kind of conciliatory. But again, I think we're just really seeing how liberals, which makes it's the slightly more tame way we might have talked about these kinds of people before. When push comes to shove, and certainly in the context of the pandemic and its aftermath, how brazen and authoritarian a group of people and lawmakers those are. I mean, the thing that surprises me, and we talked about this in the podcast last week, is how once again, in the face of another populist revolt, you just see the left ride in behind the political class, the kind of centrist political class, and just be their useful idiots, buy all this bollocks about this all being about transphobia or racism or whatever, and lend moral authority to the crackdown effectively, even if they might not, actually support it formally. They've helped bring this about. So again, it's that kind of coalescence of all of those interests against the truckers, but part of that regrettably also includes people who in another moment might like to believe that they would be at the forefront of a revolt such as this, but not this kind of one. It's the wrong kind of one as far as they're concerned.
And obviously there's a kind of class dynamic to these protests. I mean, Ella, what do you think it says about the broader class dynamic of COVID restrictions, COVID mandates, that kind of thing?
Yeah, well, we know that throughout the successive lockdowns in this country and in other countries, the first one, maybe everyone seemed to be in it together. There was a sense of national spirit or international spirit. And then it became apparent that the people who could afford to stay at home were of a particular wealth and security. It was kind of middle-class people who enjoyed having the parks and streets clear to go on their walks and having this kind of disassociated sort of state in society where the help and everyone who does all the dirty stuff kind of stays away and wears masks. And maybe I'm being a bit crude here, but, the successive pictures we have now of public events where you have all the celebrities having a great time and then there's all the kind of waitresses and waiters on the edge with masks shows that there has been a class dynamic throughout this pandemic.
The Super Bowl at this weekend being the prime example.
Pictures of Ellen DeGeneres and all these people who've celebrated mask wearing conspicuously maskless. But nevertheless, there has been, Tom makes a good point, that there has been genuine and conflictual, but genuine upsurges of kind of populist interest over the last few years. We've had, as we mentioned in the podcast last week, the Gilets jaunes. We've had protests across Europe. We've had some of the protests in Trafalgar Square in London over the course of the pandemic. There's, not all of them are perfect. Not all of them are kind of copied out of how to have a brilliant kind of working class left-wing revolt playbook. But when is life ever like that? And instead of trying to engage with this quite exciting moment where lots of ordinary people are saying, hang on a minute, I'm not going to go along with these undemocratic measures, you're affecting my life, finding their voice, that thing that the left always says they want to help people to do, no one wants to hear from them because they're challenging the norm, which is that the idea that politics should be done in the fray of the public sphere, not by technocrats. The reason why so many people on the liberal left like Trudeau is because he just keeps it safe. He has this kind of crib sheet of what's right, saying nice things about trans people, saying bad things about white privilege, whatever it is. And that's how you keep politics safe and neatly tied up. When you start to talk about it in a public square or hold a protest or throw questions out, that's when it gets dangerous because it might not go the way you want. And I think this is really revealing the cowardice of some of those who call themselves progressives.
Yeah, that's at the heart of it, Tom, isn't it? These truckers Tories are rudely intruding into our nice politics that should be, you know, managerial and technocratic and
exactly
uncontested.
And as far as the left concerned, if anything like this is going to happen, it should be led by them, you know, and anything that isn't really upsets them. I think it's so right to say this is about so much more than vaccine mandates at this point. Obviously, that particular rule that was brought in where unvaccinated truckers going from the US to Canada have to quarantine on when returning was the kind of spark that lit the fuse and all the rest of it. But it has just brought to the fore all of those kind of burning issues which were at the heart of the COVID response, reflected a lot about society already. But you effectively had authoritarian measures brought into the end of controlling a virus that many people across the world were happy to go along with in order to again, protect one another and to protect people in their society. But then to see that you had this whole policy which relied on the working classes continuing to work effectively, continuing to have to brave, you know, the pandemic world. And then for their trouble, even as we're moving out of this pandemic, certainly in a lot of Western highly vaccinated societies, they're finding their rights still being taken away. They're being deprived of their livelihoods if they don't comply, and they're being smeared as fascists to boot. So much of this is just, it's kind of, it was sparked by the vaccine mandates issue, but it's about so much more than that, definitely.
If you're a regular viewer of this show, I'm sure you've heard me talk before about ExpressVPN, and there's a good reason for that. I can't stress enough how important it is to protect your online activity from big tech. But there's actually another reason I and so many viewers of this show love using ExpressVPN, and that's Netflix. What ExpressVPN does is it encrypts your data and reroutes it through a server location of your choice. This not only protects your data, but it also lets you control which country you want your internet browser to think you're in. And that's where Netflix comes in, because it means I can access tons of incredible content, like TV shows and films from other countries that would otherwise be blocked. ExpressVPN lets you choose from over 90 different countries, so every time you run out of stuff to watch, you can just fire up the app on your laptop, your mobile, or your smart TV, switch your country, and hit connect. And here's the best part. It's not just for Netflix. You can use ExpressVPN to unlock shows or sports or other streaming services too. So be smart. Protect your data and stop paying full price for streaming services while only getting access to a fraction of their content. Visit expressvpn.com/spiked right now and get 3 extra months of their service for free. That's expressvpn.com/spiked to learn more. So let's talk about the supposedly imminent invasion of Ukraine by Russia. Funnily enough, we were actually given a date for this invasion. It should have taken place on Wednesday, depending on what newspaper you read, either at 1 a.m. or 3 a.m. Now, obviously, we're hostage to fortune talking about this now because it could happen at any time. But it notably hasn't happened, Tom. I mean, what is going on there?
I mean, it was so striking, just as you say, all of these reports that were kind of building it up, almost as if it was like a build up to like the Super Bowl or something like this. You know, as Tim mentioned in his piece on Spike this week about all this, you had, again, you know, in the Sun was giving one time, as you were saying, the Mirror was giving another, Reuters having this live feed on Kiev. I mean, almost people can watch along and see, you know, the bombs being dropped or whatever it was. It was really quite strange. And then this response that we've seen throughout the crisis, which is on the ground in Ukraine and on the ground in Russia, the mood being so incredibly different.
Yeah.
First of all, you had a lot of pretty much trolling from a lot of Russian officials saying that, you know, if the Western media knows our schedule for all of our various invasions over the next year, could they let us know so we can plan our holidays? But also in Ukraine, nowhere near that kind of level of threat felt. I mean, obviously, you know, there's an argument that it's a kind of case of suggesting that, of course, they don't want to kind of further kind of spook the markets or to push away any kind of investment and all the rest of it by making themselves into a war zone in many people's minds. But even in Russia, which is another part of this which doesn't get talked about enough, if Putin was going to do something as crazy as kind of invade Ukraine, you know, roll the tanks all the way up to Kiev, this would be incredibly unpopular. You know, just the images of, you know, Russian soldiers being sent home in body bags could be something that genuinely does it for him, regardless of how, you know, irreproachable his position often seems to be at a certain point. And yet the Russian public, from what you see from even Western journalists on the ground, are not being prepared for this kind of conflict. It's not the main topic of discussion. When it is being talked about, it's mocking Western leaders and Western media for acting as if Europe is once again on the brink of war, when that's certainly not the mood on the ground. So it really spoke to the complete kind of disparity in atmosphere and reactions that you see on both sides at the moment.
Ella, what have you made of it?
I think it's really revealed the kind of ignorance and the kind of reprehensible behaviour among the British political class. Some of the things that have happened over the last week have been really shocking. I mean, Liz Truss has showed herself up to be not only kind of an idiot with a too small grasp of geography on the one hand, embarrassing herself on the trip by kind of trying to grandstand with Russian officials and not even knowing what regions are where and owned by who and all the rest of it. But also just using Russia as a means of, I think Tim Black called it the kind of warmongering pantomime or something, like using it as a stage from which to, a little bit of mounting her own potential leadership campaign. There's, despite the fact that we're supposedly on the brink of war, we're talking about how much Liz Truss looks like Margaret Thatcher in her fur hat. Yeah. Kind of prancing around taking pictures at a time that's supposed to be of serious, international politics is supposed to be seriously on the brink. You have Ben Wallace being reprimanded only really slightly for talking about linking things to appeasement and talking about there being a whiff of Munich in the air. Just basically treating Russia like trash, which you don't have to be the biggest fan of Putin, of which none of us are, to suggest that this is probably not a good, if you really are dealing with the person you think you're dealing with, which is some kind of maniacal, evil guy who's going to do ridiculous things like run troops up to Kiev. Why are you treating him so badly then? Where is the diplomacy?
Hitler, essentially?
Essentially, why are you making him out to be this kind of folklore devil? And throughout this, I think there's been a level of incredulity among Russian politicians and indeed among Russian citizens who are just saying, why the hell does the West hate us so much? Why do British politicians and American politicians want to carry on the politics of the Cold War to a certain extent, which is to use Russia as a means of trying to garner domestic credibility? And the level of warmongering, or actually just the kind of the blasé attitude about warmongering among the British media has also been shocking. Had people today in newspapers or on TV shows saying, oh, well, it was supposed to be D-Day yesterday and it wasn't. It's like, hang on a minute. Just to get right down to the basics, we're actually talking about the prospect of lives being lost. Do you not care about that? Do you not care about stability, international stability? So it's pretty depressing, actually.
It seems to be quite a binary view in the British media that you're either gung-ho for war with Russia, in which case you're very smart and intelligent, or if you're wary of this chatter, then you're an appeaser of Putin.
You're his best friend,
you're a traitor.
You're a traitor, yeah.
It's absolutely demented. And you see this incredibly circular argument going on because people who've, taken in an interest in Ukraine for about the past 5 minutes have decided that this is the narrative and any deviation from it is to be punished. I mean, Mary Dejevsky writes for Spike, was on the radio the other day discussing a lot of this. And every time, using a lot of her expertise, a former Moscow correspondent, raises any of these points, the fact that Putin is on record saying that he recognises the sovereignty of Ukraine or whatever, so, well, you're going to just take his word for it. Or saying that, fundamentally, this is not within... this is a question of kind of Russia's interest. It sees it as its security interest. Again, the westward expansion, or the eastward rather expansion of NATO is the provocation as far as Russians are concerned. Even raising that, it was like, what, are you just some sort of Putin stooge at this point? Even to just kind of discuss in a rational way the fact that Russia has a position, it has its own national security interests as it sees it, and that it can therefore see the actions of the West from the 90s onwards as a provocation. Even talking about that is just to provide a sop to the new Hitler. This is not how you have a proper discussion. It's incredibly reckless. And you also know that even if, because, who knows what could happen. This is still a genuinely unstable situation. You have a rising of tensions like this, not least because of all of the provocations from the Western side. There's always a chance that something could light the spark, as it were. Unlike all of these people who write these endless features getting inside Vladimir Putin's head, I don't claim to know what he's thinking and what he's actually planning to do, whether he would be mad enough to do something like this. But at the same time, you do kind of get a sense that even if the worst did happen, all of these people will just get bored and talk about something else in 5 minutes' time. And the consequences of it, even if this doesn't come to anything militarily at the moment, are still incredibly serious for Ukraine because of the fact that its economic situation is going to be incredibly difficult the longer it's presented as a would-be war zone all the time. And this is something that President Zelensky has talked about and has basically constantly tried to kind of calm down what he refers to as the sort of Western alarmism. Because even absent, Russian tanks rolling on Kiev, this whole standoff, as it's being presented, has serious consequences in the here and now. But these pundits don't care about it.
They're estimated the Ukrainian economy is estimated to be losing between £2 and £3 billion a month, because obviously, with there being a potential war, you can't get insurance, you can't, get flights there. You completely destroyed their tourism industry. And, it's great that people are going about their business and are not afraid, but it's interesting how the media has spun that as them being overly stoical or something like that, when really the reality is they don't believe that an invasion is imminent.
Yeah, as opposed to the West, where Tim makes the point that having just left a forever war in Afghanistan, the West seems willing to kind of recreate another one, institute another one, in the form of there being, not necessarily if there's bombs dropping from the sky and tanks on the ground, but that this tension around Russia is just something that's a given. It's been described as the new normal, as if there's no end in sight to it. I mean, we don't often agree with Jeremy Corbyn and Diane Abbott on this podcast. However, the kind of talking about making this into a binary, the spectacle that's gone on with the Labour Party's response to this over the last week, with Keir Starmer slamming the Stop the War coalition and calling Corbyn and Abbott kind of Putin kind of brown noses at this point for suggesting that maybe the West and NATO have some kind of responsibility in the actions that they've taken over the last few years of kind of expansionist projects. Keir Starmer comes out and says, no, we are absolutely in support of NATO. Basically, we're right behind the Conservative government. And if we don't do something about this, then you're kind of, you're appeasing war. You're suggesting that there's something credible in Putin's threats, which is, it just goes to show you that all sense of proportionality and principle in this has been lost. Never mind the fact that Keir Starmer himself went and marched with Stop the War coalition against the Iraq War, used to have a history of having some kind of principle in relation to Western intervention, but seems to have ditched it all.
Keir Starmer wants to remodel the Labour Party, he said in an interesting op-ed, around the two N's, NATO and the NHS. Now, there's a lovely thought.
Our NATO.
Yeah. So let's talk about another part of Europe, Central Europe this time. The European Union's kind of culture war, legal battle with Hungary and Poland has gone to the next stage. The European Court of Justice has essentially ruled that it's okay for the EU to withhold funds from countries like Hungary and Poland if they're seen to be breaking the EU's core values in some way. I mean, this has some potentially very serious consequences, particularly with the Hungarian elections coming up in April. Tom, what have you made of it?
Well, as you say, it's just a kind of another moment in that kind of ongoing battle between Brussels and between these kind of wayward Central and Eastern European states as it sees it. So Hungary and Poland losing this legal challenge. It's one specific mechanism by which this is happening, as you were saying, kind of it being the ECJ ruling it's legitimate to deprive these countries of these funds if it doesn't meet these rule of law standards and all the rest of it. But there's various different mechanisms, there's various different arguments. The broader context is over everything from, again, the kind of questions about the independence of the judiciary in Poland. In Hungary, you have this big blow up over the promotion of LGBT to under 18s. So they've brought, tabled a new law last year, which caused huge consternation. I mean, you had Mark Rutte, the Dutch Prime Minister, suggesting that Hungary had to be brought to its knees over this, and it had no business being in the European Union. So at its core, it is this argument over self-determination as to whether or not, by dint of being a member of the European Union, that Brussels can dictate and force you to walk a certain line, not only in terms of, say, the setup of your trade or the economic regulations you might follow, but even your values, really, how you happen to run your country, the nature of your state and all the rest of it, even down to these kinds of moral questions, effectively. And as you say, particularly with the Hungarian election approaching, that this being of huge significance for the broader EU project, because there is this huge kind of rogues gallery coalition of everyone from the far left to actual fascists who have teamed up to try and topple Orban. There's a genuine sense that this would be a huge win for Orban if he goes. And so, of course, the message that is clearly being sent is to suggest we are willing to deprive Hungary of these funds. So therefore, if you want your coronavirus support money, which is being withheld from Hungary and Poland at the moment, you better do the right thing come April. So it's incredibly serious. But at the core of it, aside from the kind of technical niceties, if you like, is this question of self-determination, which we all know is the EU's probably least favourite thing.
Ella?
Yeah, the question is, which do you prefer? The problems going on within Poland and Hungary, considerable issues of Orban supposedly giving out money to his friends and family rather than, and kind of soaking up all bids for money for institutions and projects in a kind of cronyistic attempt, and that being a problem of democracy. Or what's going on within the European Union, which is, as Tom points out, heads of state, but indeed MEPs going around and saying, hang on a minute, we have to do something about these pesky Hungarians and what's going on in this nation, sort it out. Both have questions around who has democratic control, who has political control in a country. And we've always argued that whatever happens within nation states, and certainly in the UK, we're no fans of the British government, it's always better to be able to hold the country, the government that rules your country, to account, rather than unelected institutions like the ECJ, like the EU. There is a real arrogance also towards the way in which the kind of discussion about funds is being had. The fact that it's now a part of the larger budget, but the fact that initially it was the suggestion that coronavirus relief funds would be withheld, that's pretty dark, particularly in countries like Hungary and Poland, which haven't had as many resources as other European nations, of which, particularly in relation to vaccine rollouts and stuff, there is still a problem. Withholding relief at a time when the European Union is meant to be portraying itself as this great kind of benevolent international kind of big warm hug of an institution that helps out all its nations punctures that. But also the kind of idea that there's been reports, kind of scathing reports from a while ago by Timothy Garton-Ash in The Guardian about the idea that, all these sort of, particularly in Hungary, these Hungarians, they're a bit stupid, a bit like Brexit voters. They like to take EU money and they're fine with being funded by them, but they never wave any flags. And when you go to Orban rallies, they're also disparaging of the EU, and don't they realise? It was a bit like what was said to kind of people in the UK, well, don't you know you get all your money for farming from the EU, so why are you voting against it? There's a misunderstanding of the nature of the force that the EU has, the kind of political sway it has, but also the fact that there's a kind of nations are stuck between a rock and a hard place because of the fact of the imposition of the political power and financial power that the European Union has. So, pick your bad democracy. One, despite the fact that Orban's gone some way to making elections tricky, that you can deselect at the ballot box, or people who you'll never meet who sit in closed doors in Brussels conspiring to overturn your elected leaders.
So let's talk a bit about the ongoing sort of protracted Tory war on woke. There's been two interventions this week, one from Tory party chair Oliver Dowden, who said that this woke psychodrama is weakening the West. And we also had Education Secretary Nadeem Zahawi, who's issued new guidance, which he hopes will deal with the problem of activist teachers in the classroom. Tom, what have you made of it?
Well, as ever, it's just so damp, isn't it? I mean, and often quite hypocritical. I mean, it was only last week that we were talking about Nadine Dorries trying to make certain forms of comedy illegal, and then you have her predecessor in that role, Oliver Dowden, pop up and make another one of his speeches about freedom of speech and wokeness and all the rest of it. It's such a act at this point, really. I mean, it's interesting because people talk about some of these quote unquote cultural issues as if they're kind of a frippery. It's something that the Tory party will just sort of make a lot of noise about as a means to get some votes or kind of gin up their base or get some nice headlines from the right-wing press or whatever. But there are some really important issues at play here. I mean, education is one of them. This kind of slippage that you see between effectively education and indoctrination, whether it's questions around gender, critical race theory, as it's generally referred to as, whatever, where essentially incredibly divisive or at least contested ideas around even just the nature of who we are and how we should live in society is making its way into certain classrooms as if it's as uncontroversial as teaching geography or, this is the nature of the natural world or whatever. And it's a serious problem. I mean, again, the response is pretty damp. I mean, there's the government has already kind of reminded teachers and the teaching profession about their responsibilities towards impartiality. Again, this new guidance making that clear once again. But I mean, the tricky thing is, and arguably the thing that they can't really deal with that much, is unfortunately within certain professions, within certain institutions, this is just the sort of air they breathe now.
Yeah.
They don't see the distinction. As I say, but the big problem you have to get over is people don't see this as politics necessarily. They see it as being a good person in terms of talking in these kinds of terms. But at the same time, there does need to be a pushback, because while you do have that on the other side, the politicization in some quarters is very explicit. You think about the school strikes movement and teachers, layering praise and refusing to reprimand kids who wouldn't show up to go and, join Greta Thunberg in Parliament Square or whatever it might be. All of this is so obvious, but at the same time, there's a lack of conviction in terms of tackling it, and also of a lack of recognition that this is a much bigger fight than the Tory party in another press release and another wishy-washy piece of guidance would lead you to believe, I guess.
Yeah. Ella?
Yeah, well, I mean, the hypocrisy of the government is quite staggering. I mean, Gareth Sturgey's piece in Spike this week really points that out, the fact that, Zahawi himself instituted a new kind of science curriculum which had in it guidance for teachers to take action on the environment, because the Tories
empowering students to take action.
The Tories want to greenwash everything, and so you tell me how that's not being politically biased. That is greenlighting teachers to be able to say, yes, go ahead and sack off maths class and go and hold your banner outside for the school climate strike. So and Gareth also points out Gavin Williamson trying to institute that kind of ridiculous anthem to get kids to sing One Britain, One Nation and British values in schools. So the Tories like it when it's there, the kind of the politics they like being instituted, but not the politics they disagree with. There's a sort of a infantilizing way of looking at education. I mean, politics is a central part of education. Particularly as you get to the older age of the spectrum, when you're up in sixth form, you kind of get to know what your teacher's political biases are. Most good teachers won't tell you, who they vote for or anything like that. But you can have open conversations. The problem is that there's a disingenuous kind of a note to all of the teachers who have come out in the last few days and said, the government's having a chilling effect. Because anytime a teacher does step outside the norm and try and have an open discussion, like the teacher in Batley and Spen, who tried to have an open discussion about Islamist terrorism and Charlie Hebdo and all this kind of stuff, was sent into hiding. I mean, talk about academic freedom among teachers. There was a startling silence at the beheading of Samuel Paty. Let's not pretend that teachers, in particular teachers' unions, are champing at the bit to have open discussions about race or trans ideology or any like that, and they just can't. There is a level of kind of safety and I don't like the word indoctrination, because I don't think that teachers are trying to hammer in their politics to kids, but there's a kind of a cowardice about actually trusting kids to have open discussions. There is this suggestion that, particularly with race theory, what you have is a cohort of little racists coming in, and you have to just kind of drum it out of them, rather than actually giving kids the benefit of the doubt to be able to use education to open their minds. So, the government are not going to solve this by issuing guidance after guidance. What's going to have to happen is teachers are going to have to start finding their voice to be able to say, all right, you think this, I think something else, let's have an open discussion about it.
No, I think I agree that the response from the teachers' unions and everything else is so incredibly disingenuous, because one thing that I'll say is, this could chill classroom discussion. You can't have an open discussion about politics. As you say, there's always going to be those kind of moments where, particularly with older students, you might have a teacher who might lean into their own particular views, maybe, or at least it starts to kind of show itself. You wouldn't want to necessarily chill that. But at the same time, let's be real about this. If you had a teacher at some sort of London school, at which maybe some of the parents were quite well connected, who decided to have an open discussion with those students about whether or not biological sex is real or not, maybe leaning on one side rather than the other, and on the side that the teachers' unions wouldn't appreciate, do we really think that would stand? Do we really think that wouldn't be seen as an issue? It's obvious what's going on here. And I agree, you don't want to kind of make it sound as if schools are like just sort of indoctrination factories. But the problem with all of these ideas is that it has a predetermined conclusion, and the aim is to inculcate children into those values.
Yeah.
It's not about saying, here's critical race theory. It goes back to Derek Bell, isn't it? An interesting idea. Let's talk about it. It's to say, you're white, you're black, you have different experiences because of that, and we need to teach you to see that. Similarly with the gender stuff, it's about suggesting out of the gate, there are X amount of genders, you may be one, let's talk about it, rather than it being a kind of discussion about the issues, philosophical or biological, therein. So there's so much disingenuousness on this particular question. And it's because it's not just that politics has gotten into schools, it's because a particular kind of politics has gone to schools and will brook no dissent.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem we're facing with all that is that a lot of people involved don't even necessarily see it that way. And I think that's the thing that's always going to make it so difficult to challenge, I guess.
Thank you so much for watching the Spikes podcast. We'll be back next Friday. If you hit subscribe and click the bell, you'll never miss an episode. And in the meantime, why not check out all of Spike's other videos and podcasts on this channel? And for more Spiked content, find us at spiked-online.com.